Hello and welcome to Understanding Copyright, 4 Key Concepts You Should Know. My name is Sarona Elton. I wear several hats. I am a professor and director of the music industry program at the University of Miami Frost School of Music. I am also a Yamaha master educator, as well as the head of educational partnerships for the Mechanical Licensing Collective, or the MLC for short. I am also a co-author of a book titled Music Business Handbook and Career Guide, 13th edition. Copyright can be complicated and confusing. It can be overwhelming to try and figure out what it means to you if you are a musician or songwriter. This session will discuss 4 key concepts that will help you build a solid foundation of understanding of copyright so that you can use it to your benefit. The 4 key concepts we're going to discuss today are nested copyrights, rights equals revenue, permission, owner or law, and CMO money. Let's get started with nested copyrights. There are 8 different kinds of creative works protected by copyright. The first are musical works. These are songs or compositions. The next are sound recordings. Sound recordings might be of music. They might be of spoken word, like an audio book or a podcast. Literary works. These are textual works, written works. Choreographical works. Dance steps, in other words. Dramatic works, these are plays, pictorial, graphic, and sculptural works. Audio-visual works, it's another way of saying video, and architectural works. So what exactly are nested copyrights? Nesting is when a work incorporates another work into it. So let's use a very common example, particularly in music, a sound recording of a musical work. So for example, we have the musical work, and let's think of that as being represented by a 3-dimensional box. Then separately from that, we have the sound recording, which could be also represented by a 3-dimensional box. And what I mean by nesting is when you actually have that musical work nested within the sound recording, right? The sound recording in this example, that sound recording is of a musical work. So when you're talking about the sound recording, that's not the only copyright involved. There's also the copyright of a musical work that is embedded within that sound recording that has to be considered. So let's look at another example, a song and a recording you've probably heard of called Yesterday. So in this example, we have the song Yesterday that was written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, represented there. That was then recorded, right, resulting in the sound recording, also called Yesterday, that was recorded by the Beatles. That sound recording of the Beatles incorporates within it that musical work written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And by the way, this happened multiple other times. Aretha Franklin made a sound recording of the same musical work, as did Elvis. He also made a sound recording of the same underlying musical work. So let's take a look at another example that's a bit more complicated. My students know I always find a way to incorporate Prince into almost every lecture I give. So let's take a look at an example of Purple Rain, the movie. So in this case, we start with a musical work called Purple Rain, which was then recorded by Prince and the Revolution. And so you see the sound recording there, Purple Rain, which includes within it that musical work. But then let's think about the movie itself, that audio-visual work that was Purple Rain, the movie. Within that movie, we have the sound recording Purple Rain of the musical work Purple Rain included in that movie. We also have Let's Go Crazy, another popular musical work that was recorded, and the recording is in the movie, as were a number of other recordings that were all in that movie. And we have the script of the movie, which you could consider a dramatic work in and of itself that's embedded within this audiovisual work. So look at all of that nesting upon nesting upon nesting. So why do we care about nesting? Because you have to unnest before you can analyze the copyrights, really, in any way. So if we start pulling apart that big box that we just saw, separating out the audiovisual work that is the movie, the dramatic work that is the screenplay, the musical work that is Purple Rain, the sound recording of Purple Rain, the musical work that is Let's Go Crazy, the sound recording of Let's Go Crazy, and all those other musical works and all those other sound recordings, right? We have to unnest all of this before we can really do any kind of copyright analysis about rights or royalties or anything really. So another way to visualize this, if we were doing some analysis, is if you imagine we had all of those different works that are all nested within that audiovisual work of the movie Purple Rain. We could list them all down the side of a very long page, and then we could go across the page perhaps and start analyzing each of the different rights and permissions, for example, that the company that made Purple Rain needed to secure in order to actually make that movie available, right? They had to secure all kinds of different permissions to use the screenplay and the musical works and the sound recordings. And you can imagine that you could build out a complicated rights and permissions analysis, but you have to start by unnesting all of those works. The next concept we're going to talk about is rights equals revenue. So what do we mean by rights equals revenue? Copyright ownership means having a set of exclusive rights. In other words, control over what happens with the work. Let's review what those rights are. We will look at some language the copyright law uses and then translate that into more familiar words to make it easier to understand. The first right is the right to reproduce the work. Another way of thinking about this is control over if the work is copied or not, right? Copy is another word for reproduce. Another right is distribution, or the right to distribute the work. What that means is basically control over whether the work is sold or rented or lent out. And on-demand access via streaming, that is a form of distribution. And so this right has to do with control over whether or not the work is distributed. The next right has to do with something called derivatives, the right to prepare derivatives of the work. What that means is basically control over giving permission for other new works to include some or all of the owner's work. For example, deciding whether or not to allow someone creating a movie to include your musical work or your sound recording in the movie is an example of authorizing a derivative use of the work. So the next right is to publicly perform the work. In other words, to perform it for more than just friends or family in a public place, whether that's in real life or virtually. And there's an asterisk there we need to explore. This right does not apply to pictorial, graphic, or architectural works at all. And for sound recordings, it only applies to public performances via digital transmission. It does not apply to public performances of sound recordings that are not via digital transmission, such as FM radio or in a nightclub. This is different from how copyright law outside the US treats sound recordings, where generally speaking, there is a right and a related revenue generated from their public performance. We call that neighboring rights outside the United States. And the last right is public display, to publicly display the work. And this means to display it for more than just friends or family in a public place, in real life or virtually. We also have 2 asterisks here. This does not apply to architectural works or sound recordings. So copyright ownership equals exclusive rights, as we've already mentioned. So how do rights equal revenue? Well, copyright protected works generally cannot be used without permission from the owner, and permission is generally granted in exchange for money. In other words, an owner has exclusive rights, and they are often not willing to grant permission to use their work if they are not receiving revenue in exchange for their permission. Let's think of this as a logical process, starting with a copyright owner who owns a set of exclusive rights. And along comes somebody who wants to use their work. What happens is that person or company needs permission, right? Because the owner has exclusive rights, the user needs permission. And they realize they're not going to get permission unless they offer revenue in exchange for permission. And so they make that offer, and if the copyright owner accepts the offer, then you ultimately end up with the copyright owner receiving revenue. That's how rights equals revenue. Let's use a real-life example of music on interactive streaming services, such as Apple Music or Spotify. What makes these interactive services is that you can go on these platforms and pick the specific recording you want to listen to, which is different than something like digital radio where you can just pick the channel or the station but not pick the recording. So with an interactive service, sometimes called an on-demand service, you can pick exactly what it is that you're about to listen to. These kinds of services need all of these permissions. They need permission to reproduce the musical work and the sound recordings which embody those musical works, to distribute those musical works and the sound recordings that embody them, and to publicly perform those musical works and the sound recordings that embody them. An interactive stream ultimately involves all 3 rights: reproduce, distribute, and publicly perform. Because of the nested copyrights, these services need these permissions for both the musical works and the sound recordings. So turning this set of permissions and rights into revenue, what we have is the musical work reproduction and distribution is something we refer to as mechanical royalties. Mechanical royalties are paid in exchange for permission to reproduce and distribute a musical work in a sound recording. Public performance of musical works is another kind of activity that generates royalties, and we call those performance royalties for the musical work. And here we also have the sound recording being used. That's going to generate money because of permission needed to reproduce, distribute, and publicly perform the sound recordings. And that kind of money is typically handled as a percentage of revenue paid by a digital service, ultimately to the sound recording copyright owner. Just think of all of the ways that we use music that require permission, which ultimately means they generate revenue. Here's just some of them to give you a sense, whether that's in karaoke or non-interactive streaming like digital radio, or social video like on YouTube and TikTok, or when music is performed in a concert hall or in a fitness club. These are all different kinds of uses of music where permission is needed, and permission relates back to rights. And in order to grant that permission, generally the copyright owner is going to demand some revenue. There is one other way that rights equals revenue, and this is when permission is not obtained, the copyright owner can sue somebody for copyright infringement if they use the copyright owner's work without permission. And when that happens, you're generally getting lawyers involved and courts involved, and you might end up with a legal settlement or a judgment, which ultimately would put money in the pocket of the copyright owner. Let's go now to our next key concept, permission, owner or law. You might remember that I said, generally speaking, copyright protected works generally cannot be used without permission from the copyright owner. But let's get more specific. First, we have to determine if, in fact, the work is still protected by copyright law. Copyright protection does expire after a period of time. I bet you could guess that musical works composed by Beethoven are no longer protected by copyright law. When that is the case, permission is not needed because there is no copyright protection in effect for that work any longer. But let's say we are dealing with a scenario where copyright protection is in effect. Typically, for the most part, you need permission from the owner of the copyright. That is generally true. And in that case, in these scenarios, it's the owner granting permission. But two other scenarios also exist. In some cases, for some uses of some works, the law says permission is not needed. It's like an exception in the law that says for this particular work, for this particular use, you do not need to get permission. And the third scenario is where the law says actually permission is needed, but instead of the owner granting that permission, the law itself is going to grant that permission. And in these two scenarios, what we have is instead of an owner granting permission, we have the law itself answering the question with respect to permission. So let's dive deeper into this, shall we? Examples of getting permissions from an owner. These are called voluntary licenses. It's entirely up to the owner to grant this permission or not. Examples of this in the music industry are what we call sync licenses. That's short for synchronization, which is when you use music and audiovisual works. Sample licenses, which generally are using an existing sound recording in another sound recording. And interpolations, which is using an existing musical work in a new musical work. Other examples where the law steps in are where fair use comes to play. You might have heard that, and that's a topic we're not going to dive deeper into today. But for example, if someone was doing a news story about something and used a little portion of a copyrighted work within their news story, that might fall under something called fair use, which is basically an exception to needing permission. Another example is the sound recording non-digital public performance. Remember, we talked about public performance rights and how sound recordings are only protected for digital public performances in the US, not for non-digital performances in the US. And that's because the law says that basically there is no right needed for that or permission related to that. And examples where the law grants this permission, we generally call these compulsory licenses or sometimes statutory licenses. And this is where the law steps in place of the owner and says that the party who wants to use this work can use it. These are very, very restrictive in their rules in terms of which works are eligible for these kinds of licenses. And then a bunch of rules exist about how the user of that work has to behave, what kinds of royalties they have to pay. So it doesn't mean you can just use something, any way you want for free. A compulsory license looks similar to a voluntary license in that it says very specifically how a work can be used and if there are royalties to be paid, how much and to who. But these are examples of how permission might be handled, either from an owner or where the law steps in and provides that answer. Now let's look at our fourth key concept, CMO money. So CMO money is a play on the phrase mo money, which is short for more money. It's just slang. And I am shamelessly trying to get your attention by saying mo money, mo money, mo money. You need to understand how CMO money works. So what does CMO stand for? It stands for Collective Management Organization, which I know all by itself is really not all that helpful to your understanding. So maybe let's insert another word into that, see if that helps, because here we're talking about collective rights management organizations. Maybe that's helpful, maybe not. Certainly nobody would get upset if in your own mind you thought of them as centrally managed organizations, because they are. So if you want to think of CMO to mean centrally managed organizations, I think that's totally fine. So what do these collective management organizations do? They manage rights on behalf of many rights holders. They grant or administer licenses, whether that permission is coming from the owner or in some cases where that's a compulsory or statutory license coming from the law. They collect royalties from licensees, which is another word for users of the music or the works. They collect royalties from licensees and they pay royalties out to rights holders. So money flows into them from the licensees and then money flows out of them to rights holders. So let's look at some examples of CMOs in the United States. And by the way, there are different CMOs in different countries around the world. With respect to musical works, there is a CMO category that deals with performing rights. We call these performing rights organizations, or PROs for short. We have ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, Global Music Rights. These are examples of PROs, which is a subset of CMOs. With respect to musical works, we also have something called mechanical rights organizations, or MROs. Mechanical rights corresponds to permission to reproduce and distribute a musical work as a sound recording. And in the United States, we have the Mechanical Licensing Collective is considered the MRO in the United States. And then we have for sound recordings and their digital performing rights via non-interactive streaming, which is sometimes referred to as neighboring rights, especially outside the United States, we have an organization called SoundExchange. And so all of these are examples of CMOs, but they work with different kinds of works. The two on the left deal with musical works, and the one on the right deals with sound recordings. And they each deal with different kinds of rights and different kinds of licenses. So why do we care about collective management organizations exactly? Because generally the only way to collect these royalties is to become a member and register with these CMOs. So when it comes to CMO money, you really have two choices. One is to join these CMOs, the one that's appropriate for you, and register your works, in which case you'll collect your CMO money and you'll be happy. Or you can choose not to do that, in which case you won't collect any of those royalties and you won't be happy. It's really just as simple as that. We have now finished reviewing the 4 key concepts. I hope you have found them helpful to your understanding of copyright law. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. If you'd like to learn more about me or the book I've co-authored, visit SaronaElton.com. If you'd like to learn more about the music industry program at the University of Miami Frost School of Music, visit musicindustry.frost.miami.edu. And if you'd like to find out more about the Mechanical Licensing Collective, visit themlc.com. The capital letters are not needed when you type these into a browser. They're only here on this slide to make it easier to see where one word turns into another. Thanks again.